In this video, I'm going to dive deeper into how I built the serverless application. Just to give you a quick background on what I'm talking about, this is a serverless weather application that can show temperature, feels like humidity, weather, and current conditions with a slide description. So I'm going to quickly look for a place and it's going to show me the current weather of that particular location right now. Um, in this video, you can also watch the part one of the video of this two-part video series. The first one has more demo in general. This one, I'm going to dive deeper into the code and how I've integrated it with AWS resources and how I used infrastructure as code. So now that you know what this app does, let me dive straight into the front end components of this. I'm using a React setup for my current application, and as you might see, it's implemented like a few features. The first thing I want to point out directly though is I'm going to be using an open weather API, which offers the metadata that we see on this application. Uh, I'm currently also running this on my local, and I'm going to walk you through how I hosted my application from my local machine to this URL, which can be consumed by anybody over the internet. So, the first thing, I'm going to start from the back end and go all the way up to the front end of the setup. Um, so, with the Open Web Weather API, uh, there are instructions on how you can use to integrate it with the API calls. And this is what I'm going to be using in my code base to sort of query all the data. An example of the same thing can be seen here. I'm using this URL to get the API. I'm going to be passing my API key as an app ID. You want to be careful and not expose your app ID while trying to get uh, this code base onto GitHub or something like that. I've used some basic tricks to hide it, but you might want to use some stricter measures. Okay, so before I explain the other features, I would like to show you what the output of the current API call looks like in a JSON based text file. This is what it looks like. I opened it using a JSON viewer, and this is what an API example call looks like. So if you pass in like the right location, currently it's London, it gives you nice data about um, the location like temperature, feels like, humidity, country, time zone, etc. I'm going to be using some of these metadata fields to show the data around here. As you might see, the temperature, feels like, humidity, wind speed, etc. Um, Let me start with index.css. I'm importing this particular from fonts from Google APIs and using uh, this to sort of like give like a nice overall look and feel to my application. Uh, this is pretty standard CSS stuff. The CSS body, font size, header, etc. This is where it gets interesting. Uh, with this code snippet, you can change like how your background looks like in terms of like the positioning, etc. This snippet lets you add the image that you're currently seeing on the application. I've added this in the root of this directory, and that's how the image gets integrated into this particular application. I'm also aligning my search bar to the center, and I'm using the container frame to sort of have like uh, how my output looks like in a particular format, like with a particular width and how the height is, etc. Same with each individual items like the top, the description part over here, which is how I've rotated it to -90. I could do -180 and it will look tilted or something like that, I guess. But you get the point. Oh yeah, it was on the other side. Okay. Um, that's most of index.css here. Um, there is an app.js which has our API call integrated, and I'm going to be using this location search to give it like a search bar, and that's how it shows all the locations that we want to enter. Um, this snippet of code handles that. It gets the response, it shows the response. The other very important part is how I'm getting the metadata from the API calls directly. So to do that, I'm using something like data.main uh, dot temperature. I'm getting this from the API outputs that I showed earlier. So data.main dot temperature, that's how I can get these values. As you might see, it's in Kelvin. So I'm using a to fixed function to sort of get the data in Fahrenheit. Uh, I can also modify my API to have like imperial units passed on along when I make the API call. Other features like humidity and speed and even location, it works on the same principle. Like I query data.win.speed, data.main dot speed. So that's how it is. Uh, he, I'm passing it to, I'm passing another function to convert it to miles per hour. Um, Another important file to look at is the amplify.yaml. Basically, when I want to use infrastructure as code and migrate this entire setup to uh, AWS Amplify, it's going to require something like a GitHub or a backend environment where I can host all this code. So that's where I enter all my code base, and AWS Amplify lets me connect my GitHub to this uh, provisioning unit, if I may call it, but it's mostly used for deployment purposes. Uh, 1 second. So AWS Amplify is how uh, all my features are also pushed, and also how my backend changes are integrated onto the front end. It uses this particular file, amplify.yaml, to set up the various phrases like pre-build and build setup. what it does, what I mean by that is it sets up this particular environment where it will clone a repository, it will test a deployment, and it will also eventually deploy it and verify and take screenshots. Um, the more interesting part of this is when I run this setup, as you see, uh, Axios is a dependency file uh, that was entered by me in the code to be installed, and I need to take care of that dependency before the pre-execution builds. And this is how this command lets me do that. So I learned it the hard way. I spent a lot of time in trying to understand how to install a dependency, which was sort of so easy to do on my local. But AWS Amplify lets you do all of this really quickly, and I was able to uh, process my it like stand up my back end and then stand up my front end very quickly. As you see, it downloads like all the dependencies required by React.js, and it basically gets all of that data from here. Um, Let me just make sure if I had anything else to be presented in this um, video. Oh yeah. So another important thing is you might want to uh, set up your environment variables correctly so that uh, when the application does boot on startup, it's not missing this environment variables that you haven't added to the code base directly. And you might want to also add some monitoring dashboards and metrics and alarms to monitor um, the components or specific API units or anything in general that you might want to check within your application. I'm going to be adding a couple more features and some more authentication related layers on my application, and uh, that should enhance some of the features. However, I think most of it is already taken care of in terms of resiliency, high availability, and other such features. Like I have a valid URL that I could use over the internet, and users will be able to access at least a subset of the features of this application. And yeah, that's my video presentation for the weather app. Let me know if you have any other questions, and thank you for watching this.